because it is obtained through clandestine methods, there's a tendency to assume it's true. And that in spycraft is a very dangerous belief. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And we're two political science professors who have just watched episodes 4, 5, and 6 of Andor Season 2. And we're going to break down what we see as some of the main political themes, events, parallels that happen in those episodes. We watched these episodes separately, Jeff, so we came to kind of independent understandings of what might be going on in political terms. So we thought we'd just lay that out on the table first each, and then we'd use the rest of the episode to kind of reach some sort of synthesis and have a general discussion of those things. Would you like to go first?
Sure. So for me, this arc is all about doubled and mirrored relationships, people, and events. That's one of the big themes that I think we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today.
Okay, so for me, I agree with that, and I want to really get into that. I saw the kind of overarching tagline as something like too much information. And this partly goes to your mirrored theme in that both, I think it's Pardigaz, but it could have been someone else in the ISB meeting, and certainly Luthen Rael, say a version of, there's just too much information here. We're drowning in information here. Both organizations, the Rebellion and the Imperials, have a signal and noise problem. They're finding it hard to distinguish what's real from what's either disinformation or what's just kind of background noise. And I saw that come up again and again.
Yeah. And then the third thing is actually related. All of this stuff is interrelated. But the third thing that we're going to spend some time talking about is contrasting leadership styles from the Empire and from the Rebels, but also within the Rebels themselves, who are not yet in alliance.
Yeah, and there's lots of leaders on both sides kind of mirroring each other, or people starting to become like one another. I mean, we'll get into this, but I saw Cassian as sort of becoming a Luthen Rael type figure during the episode. So all this stuff is, I think you're right, very interrelated. And of course it's very interrelated because this remains a really high quality show. We're both, I think, very impressed by this arc. I thought and I mean this is the highest of possible compliments, I thought while watching these episodes, this is basically like a John le Carré spy thriller in this episode. Everything is very tightly plotted. There's lots of mirroring going on. There's lots of information and misinformation. There's lots of people who think they're in the know, but actually they don't know the overarching goal of what it is they're being asked to do. And it is sort of le Carré-esque, I thought, in its complexity and its quality.
Yeah, I mean, my quick temperature check on this arc is I thought it was phenomenal. Just, propulsive in its watchability, extremely gripping. I thought the pacing of these 3 episodes was really, really good. As you say, it's a super high quality show. Some of the acting performances we're getting at this point, I think, are very notably of an elite quality and character. And we talked a little bit off camera about Gerrera, and I think we'll spend some time talking about Gerrera, both her character and the portrayal of the character. The Cyril, that whole relationship, some of the acting, a lot of the dialogue, but a lot of the acting that we're getting at this point strikes me as much higher than the average, and extremely notable.
I agree. Okay, so that's why we're going to go in this episode. These are just our interpretations, though, and we should, of course, say that we have benefited in the past episode from reading the comments. There were some really superb either bits of information we didn't know or theories that we kind of hadn't thought of. We would love to see more of that. We do read the comments and we'll try and engage. So if you do have a favorite political theme or idea or understanding of what's going on, please kind of get in the comments and we'd love to hear it. Yeah. Okay, you want to start with the mirrors and doubling?
Sure. I think over the course of these 3 episodes over this arc, for me, this is one of the 3 big themes that we'll talk about, but for me, this was the most obvious and prominent of those themes. We're constantly being presented with mirrored or doubled figures, relationships, scenarios, events, organizations. And there's a certain way that the entire form of storytelling here is this kind of compare and contrast exercise. So it struck me immediately by the mirrored lines that come out of that refer both to Gerrera and Cass's relative relationships within their organizations. So Pardigaz tells Gerrera that Krennic only cares about results, right? As he's advising her. This is from a throwback to the previous arc. Dedra learns that Krennic only cares about results. Well, Cass says basically exactly the same thing to Bix about Luthen. He cares only about results. These are organizations that mean to fixate on the end game here and don't really much care about the process or how it happens. There's a kind of ruthlessness, in other words, about both operations. And we see this, I mean, again and again in both figures. But it's really obvious when Luthen is castigating Cassian for advising him to not get involved in the fledgling Gorman front because it's going to be a disaster. And from Cass's perspective, it's going to be so bad. They're so inept and they're so inexperienced and don't know what they're doing that they are going to do nothing but call down the worst of the Imperial thunder upon themselves for what they're doing. They're not being patient. They're not organized. They're making bad decisions. What they want to do, he tells Luthen, is meaningless because their idea of, we'll talk about this later, of a signal and the noise. What they want to do is expose the truth of what the Empire is doing in Palma. But of course, Cass is correct when he says everybody already knows what they're doing. You won't be exposing anything. You will gain nothing operationally from what you're up to. This makes Luthen irate because for Luthen, he actually doesn't care, right, about what happens to the Gorman people. He wants the symbol of a Gorman in rebellion.
It will burn very brightly.
It will burn brightly. And there's a kind of a shocking ruthlessness. We've seen this before out of Luthen, but it becomes very clear, right? And it marks an immediate distinction between his vision of what the rebellion needs to be about and Cass's vision, or at least Cass's evolving vision, I suppose. And this is the meaning of that, the scene that we saw in the trailers over and over again. I'm thinking like, he says, you're thinking like a thief. This is what Luthen says to Cass. Cass says, I'm thinking like a soldier. Luthen says, you need to think like a leader.
Yeah, so you think that's the journey Cassian's on? Because I certainly saw in Cassian's kind of cover operation, the cover he was given to Gorman, he adopts this kind of Luthen Rael persona. He's called, is it Varian Sky? Is the name he's given, and he becomes this kind of effete,
very suave, sophisticate.
Right, he's very interested in aesthetics. He's into like fabric design or whatever, as opposed to like artifacts.
Opposite of his actual role.
Yeah.
In the exact same way that Luthen's mirror opposite is this kind of high-end art dealer is the exact opposite.
Right, and Luthen, I mean, famously in the first season, before he goes back under Coruscant, Luthen has to practice in the mirror these gestures of the and of course, tremendous to see you.
He's wearing a wig.
Yeah, exactly. And Cassian wears this kind of sharp blue suit, and he tells Bix he's
very stylized in a way that we haven't seen before. In fact, I think he might be wearing a wig as Varian Sky as well, because his hair is much longer in those scenes.
And so those aesthetic choices, I think, are not just aesthetic. They're supposed to show Carrion kind of adopting elements of Luthen's like leadership persona, which again, we'll kind of get into later. Yeah, I agree that another mirroring I saw was between the two major couples. Yeah. Bix and Cassian and Dedra and Cyril. And in some senses, they're shown as parallel to one another or as similar in that they're both maintaining private relationships, but they're both simultaneously kind of an operations unit, an operatives unit for their larger organizations. But in some senses, there are also some contrasts.
Yes.
In that Cassian, it seems to me, his like number one goal is to maintain a sphere of privacy aside from the quote unquote public operative nature of their relationship. Like he's genuinely in love with Bix and he is sort of furious, I think, that Luthen is essentially seeing Bix as someone who needs to be managed, if not manipulated. Not really for Cassian's kind of benefit, but for Luthen's benefit in that it keeps Cassian able to perform his public duties. Right.
Luthen sees all of the people that he interacts with, he sees them as objects.
Right.
With the potential exception of Clea. Maybe we'll talk about that. But everybody else is an object, a pawn on a chessboard to be moved around at his will. And Cassian sees Bix as a subject. He cares about Bix. And so he's offended deeply by Luthen's inclination to treat her instrumentally as an object to be moved around in the service of some other goal. Dedra and Cyril Dedra on the other hand remains this incredibly fascinating and surprisingly charismatic figure. As we were talking off screen, when Dedra is in a scene, she is somehow chewing the scenery, which is astonishing when you consider that she's got essentially one facial expression. But the ability to convey so many varying emotions and thoughts and ideas about what may or may not be going on interiorly is kind of amazing. It's an astonishing act, I think, of visual storytelling. It's the highest of acting capacity.
Yeah, and what's incredible is that prominent in the mix of her facial expression, her one facial expression, is sort of disgust. There's sort of but seemingly with everyone, with I know it's not humanity, solely, but with humanity, with people, there's just an air of like, disgust is the only way I can think of it, and yet it's not, as you say, a monotone emotionally. She's conveying all sorts of things.
All sorts of things. There's also the overriding tone of indifference and disinterest, but at the same moment of complete and total mastery and command, at least felt mastery and command over whatever situation she finds herself in. And poor Cyril, right? Like at some point, we should probably just acknowledge that in his own way, Cyril operates in good faith, but is being constantly manipulated. And even Dedra, the person who he thinks he's in this kind of romantic relationship with, and to an extent they are, I guess maybe as romantic as Dedra could possibly be, but this is nothing like the relationship between Cassian and Bix.
Yeah.
Right? Cyril is an object here, but the difference is that unlike Bix, who is objectified and treated instrumentally by only the leader, or primarily the leader of the organization, Cyril is being objectified and treated like a pawn to be moved around the chessboard by the romantic partner as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So in sort of loose political theory terms, right, almost everyone is seen as as sort of a means to an end.
Yeah.
Except Bix for Cassian is an end in and of herself. And of course, in normal, properly functioning politics, you want everyone to be an end in and of themselves, right? Cassian is right that that's the proper end state. But Luthen is probably right that in a wartime situation, and Cassian even says we're in a war, just not everyone knows it yet. Luthen is probably right that in a wartime situation, everyone is going to be, and maybe has to be, sort of instrumentalized. And Saw Gerrera also has a para-commentary on this where he says, war is for the insane.
Yes.
You can only be an end in and of yourself in a normal politics situation. And that, of course, is what they're fighting for. But in the wartime situation, it's for the insane, and it's for those, part of that insanity is the ability to, without conscience, treat others as instrumental beings who can be, as it seems Luthen wants to do, like Gormans, people of good faith.
Yeah.
Who are led into a situation that everyone probably knows is going to be a disaster for them, but is going to be good for the overall rebellion cause.
Yeah. And then of course we get in the 6th episode the sort of these dual clandestine operations between Clea's attempt to remove the listening device and the Gorman fronts, the attempt that literally can't fail, right? Because the Empire is actually actively aiding and abetting the Gorman front's fledgling efforts to steal this weapons delivery, or this munitions delivery, I suppose. Those two scenes, right, sort of bringing together all of the themes, but they are the most obvious, it seems to be, mirroring and doubling, right? And they both reference one another, obviously, because the scenes are being intercut and interspersed with one another. They also reference, particularly the Gorman operation references back the Aldhani raid from season 1 in lots of interesting ways. So to me, it's kind of everywhere in this arc. It's the presentation of all these mirrored figures, mirrored relationships, the doubling of organizational logics between the Empire and the Rebellion, the doubling of figures within the Rebellion, which, as we say, is still splintered. There's no alliance yet. And so it is, for me, this kind of overarching theme that unites a lot of what we see. But one of the things, right, that emerges out of this is this notion that you were talking about and introducing of the signal and the noise, and distinguishing between not only good information and bad information, but too much information and not enough information.
Right. And the ability to do that is the most important thing. You know, and again, we're shown in these episodes, people with different levels of skill in distinguishing between the signal and the noise. I mean, both sides say we've just got too much information. We've just got too many, Luthen, all these lines, I can't keep track anymore. There's too much going on. He is not bad at distinguishing, I think, between signal and noise because he's a pretty skilled kind of guy. Pardigaz, you know, is presented as being not bad at distinguishing between signal and noise. But Pardigaz has a major problem, right? But the Pardigaz's kind of big scene in this is where he orchestrates the meeting of the ISB supervisors, which is this sort of kind of thunderdome of ambition and, you know, who can please Pardigaz with the information they're bringing to the table. And then he kind of has this Socratic method he engages in where he tries to draw people into saying, well, do you agree with that? Well, you're an idiot, you're wrong, and this person was actually right. And we go through another one of these scenes which sort of makes the point that what Pardigaz has bought for himself is not a good faith quest for the truth. What he's brought for himself is a game where people compete to please him.
Yeah.
And he himself recognizes that because he says to Lonnie, well played, Lonnie.
And isn't that exact locution what he first tells Dedra in season 1?
Yeah,
when she has first impressed him.
Well
played.
You're playing the game well.
Yeah.
Well, of course, Pardigaz is the idiot here, unless there's some further twist when we haven't quite come across yet. Because of course, Lonnie he is indeed playing the game well. It's just he's not playing the game on Pardigaz's team. He's playing it on Luthen's team.
The other thing that I thought about that Thunderdome element was the ineptitude of the ISB. In that moment, their inability to extract useful information out of all of these people that they've been arresting contrasts with Dedra's silence. Because who's the only person in that Thunderdome environment over the course of 2 seasons who we have encountered who is capable and apt at doing this exact thing, distinguishing the signal from the noise, was Dedra. Dedra's notably, conspicuously silent during this entire episode, and all the other ISB people are floundering.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So it throws into relief Dedra's unusually capable nature as an intelligence officer.
Absolutely. The other people who I think are having trouble distinguishing signal from noise and have too much information is the Gorman front. And I thought in particular that, you know, they have what they think is a very sophisticated read on Cyril. And what they actually have is, you know, too much information is a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, right? Then they've found out about Cyril's past, and they find it plausible that he could therefore be a guy who's on the turn, who's capable of turning against the Empire. And of course, they're just instantly led into Dedra's trap, Dedra's plan for Cyril. She is completely comfortable with instrumentalizing Cyril in several ways in this episode, or in this series of episodes. And the Gorman rebels, as I think Cassian is trying to tell both them and Luthen, that they would be better off knowing less and doing less rather than knowing more.
And he's constant, and we get this from Cassian's first interaction with the daughter, right? In which she kind of breaks the plan or breaks what Cassian thinks is protocol, which is he's going to contact them the next day. She seeks him out immediately. She breaks whatever rebel protocol should be or whatever clandestine protocol should be. And he dresses her down. He says, you're doing too much. You're giving away too much. You're incredibly lucky that I am the person who you want me to be. But your behavior right now, and also, by the way, surveilling me, like, I know you're doing that, right? You are seeking too much information, and you're doing it in a way that is actually detrimental to what you hope to accomplish.
Yeah, you just proved to me that we shouldn't actually be involved with you, and that's going to be my counsel to Luthen.
But, you know, the other person on this theme who ironically cannot distinguish the signal from the noise, even though he thinks he can, is Cyril. Right. Cyril doesn't actually know. So Cyril believes himself to be in full command of the information that he is putting out about himself, and believes himself to be fully in command on the transparency of the information that he's leaking to the Gorman front. But it turns out that he doesn't actually know what the goal is here. He doesn't know what the point of all of this is. So he also doesn't really know the difference between good information and bad information, or too much and not enough.
Yeah, because Dedra is keeping from him the overall goal, and she's instrumentalizing him in that one vector of misinformation through all this is through Cyril's mother. right? So Cyril is speaking on a channel. It's a classic spycraft, right? You say things on a channel that you believe is likely to be compromised, that are deliberate misinformation for the enemy.
Yeah.
And that there has to be grains of truth in it, but it's really what you want them to know. And Cyril's relationship with his mother is totally instrumentalized.
Yeah.
Dedra had said, I will ensure there is a level of contact, which you think at the time is she's doing that for the mother's benefit. No, actually, that in itself is a plan, because we know that that will then be monitored, and Cyril will give information that the Gormans will intercept and assume, because it's, because it is obtained through clandestine methods, there's a tendency to assume it's true. And that in spycraft is a very dangerous belief.
But not only that, also they're convinced of it because of the sincerity of this relationship, of the dysfunctional relationship between Cyril and his mother.
Yeah.
Which Dedra knows, no matter what she says, she knows that that relationship will continue. It's baked into who Edie is and how Edie envisions her relationship as a mother. Right.
Right. Yeah.
So that is also weaponized by Dedra in a way that the Gormans mistake. They understand its authenticity, but that authenticity simply leads to their further misunderstanding of how they are themselves being manipulated. And, the other thing is, as you were talking, I realized is that the other character who we see who deploys misinformation for his own purposes is Saw Gerrera. Saw Gerrera intentionally misleads, on instinct, as we'll talk about later, one of, one of his people, right, who turns out to be a double agent himself, right, a spy for the Empire, and intentionally leaks the wrong thing to him. So again, here you've got one-way transmission of information that is intended, as you say, as kind of classic spycraft misdirection.
Yeah, and that guy's mistake, Saw's kind of soldier who he shoots, his mistake is seeking too much information.
Yep.
He just asks one too many questions. That's a little more that, there is a need to know.
Yep.
And there's a need to know, for deliberate reasons, so the information doesn't get leaked. Yep. And one way you can prove yourself to be untrustworthy is by seeking to know something you don't immediately need to know.
And that, by the way, as we'll talk about later, is especially problematic in an operation like Saw Gerrera's,
right,
in which it's notable that no one else is seeking that kind of information from him.
Right.
Everyone else understands that the charismatic figure has complete control over operations, over information, and over strategy.
Right.
And that the quickest way, in retrospect, right, to prove your disloyalty would be to move outside of that relationship of charismatic, to move outside of the hold of Saw's charisma.
Yeah, absolutely. So and related to the signal and noise question was a sort of related theme of authenticity and inauthenticity. And I thought a lot in this episode about a book by a Russian-born cultural figure, kind of TV producer and then cultural theorist called Peter Pomerantsev, which is called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. Yeah. Or maybe it's Everything is Possible and Nothing is True. And it's about Putin's Russia, an authoritarian state like the Empire. And the point that's made in this book, and Pomerantsev worked as kind of a TV producer in Russia and kind of saw the sort of postmodern media kind of come into being. And the point that he makes is in kind of modern authoritarian systems, like systems of the mid-20th century to maybe the end of the 20th century, what you wanted to do was to control information and to propound a dominant narrative and to enforce that narrative. No one can disagree from the narrative. In postmodern systems like Putin's Russia as opposed to Stalin's Soviet Union, what you want to do is flood the zone with information, right? Make it so the signal and the noise are not distinguishable from one another. Make it so even authentic signals that are relevant to the problem at hand, well, there's 20 authentic signals, each of equal veracity, any one of which could be true, right? So none of them are true. If 20 things can be true, nothing is true, but anything is possible. Yeah. And it's possible, isn't it, that the Gormans are this really sort of obnoxious, horrible people. Yeah. And that's going on all over this episode. Cyril's mother has bought the Imperial propaganda, and Cyril says to her, you've been watching too much Imperial news, which we know is that a signal he's trying to send to the Gormans that I might be on the turn from the Empire. Yeah. But it's also making that point about the sort of insidiousness of media in this kind of post-truth society. Lots of stuff about authenticity and inauthenticity. Rather crucially, Luthen's information problem, he has to get that bug out of Skulden's art collection. The reason that becomes a problem is a problem of authenticity or inauthenticity, right? Skulden realizes there's forgeries.
Yeah.
So now he's got to go in, what is true and what is not true. Everything is true. Nothing is true and everything is possible, I think,
flood
what's
the
going
zone
on.
with noise, and to throw back to a much, much earlier author, it signifies nothing.
Yeah, exactly,
Right.
exactly. That stupid TV show,
Yep.
the Imperial TV show. Let's talk about politics. You mean political parties? Oh, parties, clothes, gossip, nonsense, blah, blah, blah.
Appearances, aesthetics.
Of the elite, which then links to the parties kind of Mon has to go to, where her husband says, there's so many of these nowadays. And this used to take us a year to get around this many parties, and it's going to be hard to cram in cram in a whole year's worth of insincerity in 3 days.
Exactly. It's politics of spectacle, right? Which reminded me, it throws back to the Hunger Games, right? And the way in which what's happening in the district, and we've got brutal authoritarian government that is sort of covered over playfully with aesthetic appeals to something that is sort of political, and what matters is the kind of the reality TVization of the whole thing.
Right, because the goal of the regime is not to make you believe any one thing. It's to make actually belief in anything sort of silly and kind of passé and impossible.
Signifying nothing.
Yeah, and Mon Mothma finds this when she's lobbying for votes, and a senator says back to her, we can all game numbers, Mon, but whose numbers are they? I believe what I feel. And that's the end goal of these kind of post-truth regimes, right? Is to make belief a matter of feeling rather than fact.
Exactly. One believes in power.
Right.
That's what Mon is finding, right? As she's kind of going around trying to whip up support for resistance to the emperor, what she finds are all of these moments of what these days we would call anticipatory compliance, in which people who could stand up, who could oppose power, do not feel comfortable doing so, because the only thing that they understand, the only thing they can feel, in the senator's words, is power. And that's the whole goal of the authoritarian regime.
Yeah, and we got to take a break in just a second. But the other way to think about anticipatory compliance is she's facing a collective action problem, right? Everyone has an interest in kind of putting up some opposition here, but no one wants to be the first to do it, which means like kind of no one does it. And you end up with what's called preference falsification, right? Which is you seem to be okay with what's going on in public, and you can't talk in private, or you can't trust talking in private. So you don't realize actually there's far more people on your side.
Right. And it's also the boiling frog.
Yeah, you're being boiled slowly. Okay, we need to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with further discussion of Andor Season 2, episodes 4 to 6. And we are back with our discussion of the 4th, 5th, and 6th episodes of Andor Season 2. And Jeff, I think you wanted to start this section by talking about matters of leadership.
Yeah, so what we get here are multiple forms of kind of classic leadership when it comes to movement leaders. And in particular, I think it's worth thinking about the differences here between Saw Gerrera's leadership style and Luthen's leadership style, and the sort of the not yet rebel alliance. So Saw Gerrera is a kind of classic charismatic leader. He's a singular figure. He attracts people to him and maintains people to him precisely because of his distinctiveness of self. He does not appear to have advisors. He doesn't appear to have close peers. He doesn't rely upon any of the people in his cell for advice, for really anything except technical know-how. And he's not interested or concerned about a line of succession. And we see this in the way that Wilman sort of comes eventually to under Saw Gerrera's thrall. He attracts people to him with force of personality, with force of will. Everything operates on instinct. The planning is all done by Saw Gerrera, and it's kind of mysterious how he's choosing targets. Everything kind of takes place as he sees fit. He's willing and capable of turning on a dime, right? And so he's very good at, one would imagine he's very, very good at improvising. There's a very distinctive personal style that Saw Gerrera imparts to his organization. In the same way, we can presume that Maya Pei had also imparted a very distinctive style of leadership and capacity to her organization. Now, the problem here is exactly the unclear line of succession, right? What happens to these organizations when these leaders die or when they're no longer around? Well, we saw in the first arc what happens to the Maya Pei people. They collapse into a fit of incompetence and ineptitude. That is a very classic life cycle for the charismatic leader and movement leaders, precisely because so much of that leadership style is about arrogating personal capacity and projecting personal capacity and orienting the entire organization around the distinctive characteristics of the singular leader. When that leader is no longer around or is no longer competent, the whole thing tends to fall apart. And this is a kind of a classic story of movement leadership and of one vision of movement leadership. Another classic vision is the one that Luthen employs, which is sort of the opposite of charismatic leadership, right? I mean, Saw Gerrera is always Saw Gerrera. He never portrays himself as anybody who he's not. There is no double identity. There's very little in the way of secretive or clandestine activity that he's engaged in within and his organization and in sort of announcing his presence within the rebel not yet alliance as a whole. But Luthen is very careful, right? Luthen is very interested, it turns out, in creating a line of secession. He sees his role, we can imagine, as a temporary one, as particularly suited to this part of the rebellion, getting it started, getting it financed, getting the sort of the pieces in place. I think it's clear over the 1.5 seasons now of Andor that Luthen does not imagine that he will see the results of the rebellion if it's successful. He will not be there.
Well, he ended in the movies, so
he's not in the movies. But he also, I think in this arc, we see he's very clearly training Cassian to become a leader. Clea is already a leader, and I think we finally see it here. I mean, she had been, I think in season 1, frequently portrayed as more of an assistant or a helper to Luthen. But what we see here is that she is herself just as capable and impressive of a figure in all of this as Luthen is. They are sort of partners. They're working together. And this, again, is a kind of classic archetype of movement leader, right? The person who is more collaborative, or the organization that is more collaborative, that is interested in lines of secession. And what's interesting about comparing all that to the Empire is that we know, as you know, in the Star Wars universe, that there is this charismatic leadership element, right? The Emperor arrogates power to himself and intends to orient the entire empire around his personal prerogative. And of course, Darth Vader is exactly this sort of mystical, supernatural, charismatic leader as well. But interestingly, we see almost none of that in Andor so far. Andor instead has a style of leadership that is highly bureaucratized, that is depersonalized in a lot of ways, and that precisely is the thing that sets up all of the drama in what you call the Thunderdome scenes with Partagaz and Krennic, is that these are people who are kind of jockeying for their own kind of influence within a larger structure of leadership that is not actually on the ground really oriented around a charismatic figure, right? You contrast what's happening with the Empire to what the kind of organization that Saw Gerrera runs. And of course, there's a major difference in scale here, but it's also a major difference in style. And so I think that's very interesting, right? There's a lot of classic allusions here to the ways in which organizations run. And I'm also thinking back to a discussion we had with a guest who we're going to have back on next week, Rob Farley, to season 1. And his argument that a lot of what's happening in season 1 is that Tony Gilroy is constructing Andor according to an obvious throwback to the Battle of Algiers.
Yep.
Right, which is a story itself about contrasting organizational logics, contrasting styles of leadership, and putting these styles of leadership to the test in a kind of revolutionary scenario. So I think in a lot of ways, maybe that's what we're always getting in this series, but to me, it struck me as very obvious and on the surface, so to speak, for this arc.
Yeah, the other thing that's going on is the classic thing that's going on in Andor as opposed to Star Wars, and you've just elaborated, is in this different models of leadership. But if I saw this arc in particular as having such overtones of John le Carré, the contrast is to like James Bond, which was always le Carré's contrast, right? So the classic kind of Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, the Emperor, those big major figures that are in the movies classically, that's your James Bond character, right? That big, loud, attention-drawing figures who have almost or literally kind of supernatural powers and have very sort of clear-cut motives, and do big, bold things for big, bold reasons. And in the Le Carré novels or the Battle of Algiers or in Andor, what you have is people doing things for, sometimes actually quite grubby reasons or small reasons or personal reasons. And the big thing that used to go on in the Le Carré novels was the paralleling of the kind of Soviet and British or American intelligence services, and how the people within them would be just cogs in a larger machine. They were all very flawed and doing things for kind of personal motives. And in the end, what you found out was the big showy ideas, the ideologies, that was the harsh realization that they didn't really matter.
Yeah.
That the Soviets were running games and the British were running games, and what they were doing it for had become kind of not clear to them. And that's the kind of line Andor has to tread. You need a central figure like Cassian in this, who has his own leadership style, right? Which is very much based around this constant attempt to maintain a boundary of privacy, a boundary of authenticity, a waystar of truth, an end result. And that's absolutely essential to stop you devolving into this world where you've just got two big spy organizations working against each other for reasons that they've lost sight of.
Yeah, and we've seen this, by the way, in Cassian Andor's character in season 1 with the prison arc, right? I think it was an Narkina arc, in which he is a leader of, he is literally leading a jailbreak.
Yeah.
Right? So we know he has this capacity to do this, but his style, even then, it's not a charismatic style. It is a collaborative style. It is a style in which leadership is seen as what one does in order to enable others to do the things that they're good at.
Yeah.
Totally distinct style of leadership, which might itself have something to do with the emerging tension between Luthen and Cass when it comes to this question of what it means to be a leader.
Okay. I want to talk about the very end of these 3 episodes. So are we at that point yet, or do you have another?
No.
Okay. So I want to talk about the very end of these 3 episodes, which I think we had different reactions to, and I'm really interested. You kind of talked me down from, I think, a pretty negative initial reaction I had, and kind of put it in more context. So the ending kind of scene of episode 6, the ending sequence is Bix goes into an Imperial facility and finds Ghost, tortures and kills him, and then there's what struck me as a very classic, almost to the point of cliched, kind of heroic scene at the end where the couple walk away from the building, and sometimes they throw a grenade over their shoulder and it blows up, or in this case, like Cassian presses a button and the building blows up, and there's the hero shot of them striding off into the sunset. And this whole scene, I found confusing. At first, I thought it was another dream Bix was having about Ghost, and it was going to be revealed to be a revenge fantasy. And then I thought, this has actually happened. Yeah. And I thought, well, how has she gotten access to this guy? How have they done this so easily? Yeah. Where's all his security? Yeah. And kind of what was going on? But you saw it as a little more organic to the storyline.
Yeah, I think this is seeded from. Okay. Almost the beginning of the arc, right? So first of all, we are told in the Thunderdome ISB scene.
You liked that one, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. That's great. That the big problem that the Empire is having right now, the big intelligence problem they're having, is what you called the distinguishing the signal from the noise. They've been arresting too many people, and they don't have the infrastructure, the capacity to extract useful information from all these people. Well, what's a little bit surprising about this is that we have seen in the previous season Ghost's mechanisms for extracting information from unwilling people.
But it's very boutique, right?
It's boutique.
It requires a lot of his personal investment of time.
Individual and singular. And everybody is afraid in the Thunderdome scene to say it, except for Lonnie, right? Who basically says, look, the problem is we don't have the capacity to actually interrogate people in a meaningful way. And this lays the foundation for, so they've identified a problem here, right? And the way that people above Partagaz decide that they're going to deal with this is they're going to scale Gorst's torture regime.
He has to become not a person, but a program.
A program. And of course, Partagaz doesn't, he's not happy. He's like, and so he tells Lonnie and Lonnie's coworker, I want you to like keep an eye on these lunatics, right? So the problem's been identified. There's a solution that has been announced. But what's been happening intermittently is that we have been learning more and more about Lonnie's journey as a double agent, which is first identified in season 1 and it's returned to here in this arc. And Lonnie has already met with Luthen after going dark for like 3 months, Luthen says. And Luthen is not happy with how quiet Lonnie has been. And he's not happy with Lonnie for how long it has taken Lonnie to come up with intelligence, which it turns out is not even really actionable, right? Lonnie has finally learned that what's happening in Gorman is that they're building this armory, right? And that's something is happening there, but Lonnie still doesn't know what it is. He doesn't know what the end game is. And Luthen is frustrated with Lonnie about, first of all, he's frustrated with him how long it's taken to come up with intelligence. He's frustrated with Lonnie about what he thinks is not actually actionable intelligence. And he makes it very clear to Lonnie that he wants more and expects more, and he expects more in real time. Well, Lonnie has now learned, right? Oh, and the other thing that happens, of course, is that Lonnie has been forcibly enlisted by Clea in the operation to remove the bug from Skulden's antique. And Lonnie has played that role. He doesn't want to play it, but he follows the chain of command here. Clea's in charge, and he follows what she wants to do, and he proves himself to be capable in that moment. So what's happened here, right, is that Lonnie is privy to this information about Gorst, and he immediately goes, we don't see this, but this is certainly what's happening. He immediately goes and gives actionable intelligence to Luthen. Luthen, at the same time, has had this confrontation with Cass about Luthen's engagements, I suppose, with Bix, right? Luthen looks at Bix. He sees somebody who is a potentially talented rebel, or somebody who, has a kind of interpersonal sense, can intuit things. And we know, by the way, Luthen and Bix have been working together for a long time by now. Bix was Luthen's kind of contact on Ferrix. But when he goes to see her, he sees she's a mess, right? She is still in the throes of a lot of trauma, which we have seen relating back to her torture by Gorst. She is increasingly relying upon, drugs of one sort or another in order to kind of dull her trauma or to dull her pain. She's become heavily reliant upon Cassian, and she seems to spin out of control when he's not around. And, when Cassian finds out that Luthen has kind of been over and been kind of cultivating outside of Cass's presence this relationship with Bix, Cassian loses his temper and goes and confronts Luthen. And Luthen says, look, Bix is spinning out of control and she's becoming a problem. And you're going to have to decide sooner or later whether you can put up with her as this problem anymore.
Right, which is exactly what he said to Mon Mothma about her childhood friend in the previous episode.
And Cassian knows what he knows what's being said to her, and he pushes back to Luthen. He says, no, if you want my blood, if you want my best, this is your time to enable it. He's basically saying, you need to help me make sure that Bix can be
so the explanation. One of the difficulties I had with it is that it seemed just too easy to get to someone who was that important to the Empire. I guess the explanation that
Lonnie sets it up,
right? That he's such a sort of importance that also shows.
Lonnie sets it up because Lonnie, remember, has been put in charge by Partagaz of keeping his eye on this scaled up operation.
Sure. So this shows by implication how much Luthen values Cassian, right? Yes. Because he's prepared to potentially burn what must be the best sauce that he has in Lonnie by setting this up. Because the Empire is not going to just be like, oh, Gorst got killed, right? This was a crucial person. This is a massive security fit. All right.
Just to complete the,
Yeah.
I mean, Luthen imagines that this is the thing that will turn Bix into this kind of mature revolutionary rebel leader and will help her to process her trauma. He's almost certainly going to, I think, turn out to be wrong about that.
Sure.
But this is the favor that he's doing for Cassian.
So here's what I'd like to see then in the...
And so just one last thought. So when they walk out together, I think it's important that they walk out together. They are now peers. They are now equals. Contrast that with Dedra and Cyril again, right?
Yeah.
This is, again, it's a throwback to the very different nature of the relationship between the two couples.
Sure. So here's what I'd like to see then in the remainder of Bix's arc. Because what are the things that have happened to Bix recently, right? She's been for one arc of an episode, or one episode arc, series of episode arcs, leered at and nearly raped, and then kind of the problem has been taken care of. And then there's been this ongoing kind of torture, you know, that she's been an object of torture, right? And then she's been able to solve the problem. But in both circumstances, she's been kind of acted upon and then had some moment of agency in sort of revenge. What I think would be appropriate now for a character is that she exercises some agency, you know, maybe even separate or at least in co-equal collaboration with Cassian, that she's kind of on the offense. Because I know we often pick just a couple of nits at the end of our episodes. There is a danger in falling into some tropes here about what you do with attractive female stars of TV shows and movies, right? Which is they're objects for nefarious male attention, and the moment of triumph is, it's just that, but they don't actually then independently take action in the world. So it would be good to see some of that in future episodes.
It would be, and I think we will. And I think the hint that we will is the way that Bix is portrayed in that final scene. She is portrayed wearing a robe and with the hood up, right? This dress, this attire has been throughout the entire series the marker of the mature rebel. Cass wears it. Luthen wears it. Clea wears it. Both Cinta and Val wear it at multiple times. When Mon Mothma is doing her most important work for the rebellion, her head is covered in the same way. And here, Bix is walking out, and the first time we ever see her that I can recall in this series, essentially wearing the rebel uniform.
Yeah. Okay, I have three quick questions for you to finish, and maybe if people are still watching, if you want to put your answers to these questions in the comments, that would be cool to see as well. Question 1, this is a scale of 1 to 10. How erotic is the Cyril and Dedra sex scene?
2?
2? So you're basing that on
2.5.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And now it's all imagination, right? Because Dedra is absolutely clear. Out go the lights, and you can see this sort of playing across Cyril's face. I think there's tremendous eroticism in there, in their relationship, and it's precisely in what is not shown, and it's precisely in what we were saying about Dedra's. It's both of them actually tremendous actors, and that they're so clenched. They're in such a tight state of clench that it becomes its sort of own eroticism. Okay. So all right, you say 2, I say substantially higher than that. I don't know, 7, I think. Okay. It's what you don't see. Question number 2, this can also be a 1 to 10 scale. How hard did you cheer when you saw a TIE fighter in the background when Saw Gerrera was shown on screen? Isn't that the first time we've seen it? Not a yes. No, sorry, I'm not TIE fighter. An X-wing. How hard did you cheer when you saw an X-wing in the background?
I wouldn't. So, how hard did I cheer? 1, I didn't cheer at all, but I did note it.
You're not that kind of guy.
I thought it noted all. Yeah.
Okay. I thought it was fantastic. It's a lovely little Easter egg.
Yeah.
Question 3 and final question: does Luthen have a literal bat signal for Cassian?
Yes.
Like the thing, didn't you think of that? Like, the bat signals come out, and Bix is like, it's flashing again.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
The other thing it could be is Gatsby's green light,
Very different kind of longing.
Yeah, I guess so. All right, so another really good arc of episodes, I think. We're on to next week. We will be joined by a third political scientist. We're going to have Rob Farley come in from, where is Rob?
University of Kentucky.
University of Kentucky. So he's going to beam in via the internet. So that's, there's going to be a literal 33 percent more poli-sci pros reacting to the next series of episodes. But Jeff, again, it's been an absolute pleasure.
I've loved it.
On that bombshell.